All right, so we're going to start talking about ecology here, and we're going to do 3 sort of quick units on ecology before we move into genetics and cells. Who here has heard the term ecology or ecological? Or who has heard something called eco? It's eco-friendly. You heard that? See that on a lot of products. Stuff gets sold to us that way. Remember how at the beginning of the year I said one of my big goals for you is to develop good BS detectors? Be able to tell when somebody's trying to sell you something using science that isn't so sciencey. A lot of stuff gets sold to us as eco-friendly, and some of it is and some of it isn't. So we'll talk more about that. But what ecology is, it's the study of how all the things on the planet relate to one another. And it actually comes from the Greek oikos, which means household. So it's like a household accounting system, what comes in, what goes out. That's sort of the roots of the word, but we don't much focus on that here. So I gave you this slide with no blanks. This is your learning goals for the whole chapter. And this really, a lot of these are actually going to extend through the next couple chapters that we do. But we're talking in all of ecology, we're talking about how living things are interacting with one another and with the parts of the environment that aren't alive. That's what we're doing. And we're looking at how matter and energy move through the world and how energy gets stored or it gets lost. You guys do the water cycle in middle school?
Yeah.
Do you do the carbon cycle in middle school?
No.
Do you do the nitrogen cycle in middle school?
No.
That's what I thought. Okay. So we also look at what limits how many things can live in a given place. What limits how many things? I mean, if we imagine the Earth as a house, if we think about this as real household accounting, what limits how many people can live in your house?
How many bedrooms?
Well, how many bedrooms and couches and, whatever else? A good friend of mine is one of 12 kids, and he grew up on a farm in southern Mexico. She grew up in East Palestine. How they met is a long and complicated story. But when they were newly married and then they were expecting their first child, well, they bought a 2-bedroom house in Chippewa. And then they had their daughter. Okay, they had 2 nice little bedrooms. Well, then she got pregnant again. And she said, oh my God, we have to build a 3rd bedroom. We have to figure out, there has to be another bedroom. The kids can't share a bedroom. And her husband was really very puzzled by this. He was one of 12. How many people do you think he shared a bedroom with for most of his life?
3.
Well, it was usually a boys' room and a girls' room. And, there might be, 3 or 4 or 5 boys at any one point. There's a pretty big span of years, so some of them would move on. But, he didn't understand this. Like, why do we need another bedroom? We're having another baby! Yeah, but what does that have to do with anything? Why do we need another bedroom? We can put 2 kids in that room. They built another bedroom. They turned a walk-in closet into the 2nd bedroom, and that's what Logan got stuck with. It's okay. I mean, it's bigger than what Harry Potter lived in, so that's good. But there are limits to how many people you can fit in a house. There are limits to how many things you can fit in an ecosystem. Look at that.
Do we have to write on this one?
Yeah. You do have to write on this one. We're going to talk about how we organize all the living things on the planet, how we organize the world. So we talk about levels of organization, and we'll talk about this at a smaller level as we get into cells. But when we do the whole zoom out view, and we look at the entire Earth, and we consider every single living thing on the Earth, we call that the biosphere. You're part of the biosphere. I'm part of the biosphere. If suddenly you waved a magic wand and all the rock and all the water and all the gases of the atmosphere disappeared, and all we were left with was the living things hovering as a quivery, wiggly, squirmy, weird, and suddenly very alarmed, I should say, ball in space. This is one of my favorite little thought experiments. Well, we wouldn't be living long, that's true. But in that one like millisecond, wouldn't it be cool? Because it would go down pretty far into the earth. What's down below the surface of the earth that's living?
Lava.
Is lava living?
Yes, it's moving.
Lava, okay. Okay, what is lava?
Lava is molten.
So we would see bacteria in the soil. And they go pretty far down. As we get closer to the surface, we would see worms and insects and bugs and all sorts of things. Those are all alive. Those are part of the biosphere. As we go, I mean, on the surface of the earth, that's easy pickings. In the water and walking around on the surface, we've got animals, we've got plants, we've got bacteria, we've got fungus. What's above the earth's surface that's alive? One thing.
Humans.
Okay, human above the earth's surface, so not on the surface.
Air.
Okay, so one thing that you would find not touching the earth's surface that's alive. Give me one, Ian. Birds. Birds are flying in the air. Give me one other thing.
Outside.
Not in the air. Bats, which are mammals. Are there bacteria in the air?
Yep.
Yeah. Those are alive. So things that are living are capable of reproducing themselves. They're capable of growth, and they're made of cells. We talked about this early in the year, but it's been a while. So the biosphere goes way up into the atmosphere and pretty far down below. And the oceans are full of life, and the surface of the continents is full of life. It's pretty amazing stuff, really. And yet, despite that fact, when we put it in context and scale, if we turn the whole Earth into an apple, the biosphere is pretty darned thin. Well, I mean, the biosphere is made up of billions upon trillions of parts. You know, if one living thing dies, does the biosphere break? No, living things die all the time. So the biosphere is sort of this thin layer of living stuff that's on the surface of the planet and above the surface of the planet and below the surface of the planet, in the oceans, in the soil, in the air. Now, this is the cool part. That called Biosphere 2. You can go visit it. I used to live up here. Those are the Santa Catalina Mountains, north of Tucson. I lived in a little village called Summer Haven up on the top of the Santa Catalinas on Mount Lemmon. And this sits on the back side of the Santa Catalina Range. So let me pull up a map because I'm fond of mountain range. So here's Tucson, Arizona. It's a nice little city. It's probably population-wise a little smaller than Cleveland, but it's in a desert. And on the north side of Tucson, what they always call City North, because when you're in most of the city looking north, you see this mountain range, and that's Santa Catalinas. And if you look north of the Santa Catalinas, there's a little town called Oracle. And that little town called Oracle is where Biosphere 2 is. And within Tucson, there's the University of Arizona. It's a big state college, state university, and they built this thing.
Out of what?
Cement and glass and steel. And it is supposed to be an entire biosphere. So here was the plan. Plan is we pump in everything that we would need, and then we take 11, they called them bionauts, and we lock them inside for a whole year. So if you were going to go be enclosed in that, without saying a word, do not say anything out loud, do not yell anything out. You can talk to somebody at your table if you have someone at your table. Start writing down the things that you would need to spend an entire year in an enclosed system like this. Okay, so food. Now, if you look at this picture, that look like anything to you? Like a big greenhouse, maybe?
Possibly.
Yeah, it was basically, most of this is all a large greenhouse. This was a large dome also. And this is in the deserts of Arizona. They get a lot of solar energy in. Earth gets a lot of solar energy in. Earth gets it from the sun. That's the same place Biosphere 2 was getting it. Solar, who here has ever been inside a greenhouse on a sunny day?
Me.
Heats up pretty well.
Yeah.
Now, can you see that there are plants growing in that big greenhouse?
No.
It looks like there are sort of shadows behind the glass. Those are trees. And they actually had a rainforest in that tall part. So they had tropical plants. They imported soil. They had soil bacteria.
How can you pack that?
They had animals in there. Oh, yeah. They had bacteria. They had insects. They had birds. Now, they also had a miniature ocean with bacteria, with some fish.
Sharks.
No, they didn't, because they didn't.
How are you gonna
You
let
aren't
this
going to,
go on?
hold, you aren't going to, piece by piece, you aren't going to put in species that aren't directly impacting survival.
Oh, okay.
Now, on Earth, there are a whole lot of species here who have evolved from earlier, simpler forms. They're here. If you're transporting something like this to the moon or to Mars to build a base, it's going to go up a piece at a time. It's going to take decades to build, and you're going to import things, in small quantities. It will literally be decades before it's habitable. Here, they had the advantage of they can truck it up on a semi-truck, open the doors, put it in. If you're building this on Mars or on the moon, which we may do someday, it's quite possible. You're bringing these things in bit by bit. Those bacteria, do you have to bring all the bacteria you're going to need? Do bacteria reproduce themselves?
Yes.
Yeah. Give them the right conditions, their populations will grow. Give the trees the right conditions, their populations will grow. Give the fish the right conditions. What are fish good at? Making more fish. What are insects good at? Making more insects. So you're going to grow a lot of those things over time as you're building this out. Of course, here again, they put it all in. They were ready. They were growing their own food. Has anybody here seen the movie The Martian? I highly recommend it. It is so good. I mean, it's Matt Damon, and the science is really good. It was written by an engineer. It's pretty fantastic. But it deals with some of these very concepts.
Plants.
Well, they need plants. Why do they need plants?
They get food.
Okay, so other than
Oxygen.
eating parts of the plants are going to give off
Oxygen.
oxygen. What are the plants going to absorb?
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide. What we breathe out, the plants will breathe in, and the plants will take that and produce oxygen. That's a pretty handy trade-off. So, could you, with a whole lot of math, could you figure out how much CO2 Jace is going to breathe out in a year, and how much CO2 Cammie is going to breathe out in a year, and how much CO2 Madison and Matt are going to breathe out in a year? Yeah, you could. Could you then figure out how many plants we would need to absorb all of Jace's CO2, and how many plants we would need to absorb all of Cammie's CO2, and how many plants we would need to absorb all of Madison's CO2, and how many plants we would need to absorb all... Yeah. You can actually compute that stuff. It's crazy. I mean, you don't actually do by hand any of this. You plug it into a computer model that has all of these known factors in it, and it says you will need this many of this type of plants to absorb all of your carbon dioxide and to produce enough oxygen for you for the year. How many calories will Dante need in a year? How many calories will Riley need in a year? How many calories will Ian need in a year? I mean, has anybody here gone camping?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Did you go car camping where you pull up your little car and you set up your little tent and you sleep in the tent next to the car? Okay. There's another kind of camping called backpacking, where you put all your stuff in a pack and you park your car and you walk away from your car and you don't come back to your car for 3 or 4 days. Okay, well, I go backpacking, and usually on the kind of like low-grade backpacking trips that I've usually done, you throw a bunch of food in your pack and you're fine. We always have extra food at the end. But at one point you sleep in a tent, usually on a mat, or you can sleep on the ground, whatever. We did a big through hike where it was 70 miles over 12 days. And you got to carry everything that you're going to need for those 12 days over those 70 miles. And my dear, wonderful, good friend, who had done a lot of this kind of thing, did the trip planning. And the trip planning goes like this. You are allowed 2,500 calories per day. The lightest way we can get you those calories is this. Here is your cheese powder. Here is your pasta. Here are your 3 protein bars. That's Monday.
Okay.
Here is your cheese powder and your pasta and your 3 protein bars Tuesday. Oh, Wednesday, we have a chocolate bar for you. You're planning exactly how many calories you need for every day of that trip because you have to carry it all on your back. So for this kind of endeavor,
Jeez.
for the 11 bionauts, they have to figure out how many calories each of those 11 people will need per day. How much food can you grow in a year to provide those calories? How much food can you start the system with, to provide those calories? While making sure you're not going to run out of oxygen or water. It's a pretty big challenge, logistically. And again, if at some point there's a human base on the moon or base on Mars, it'll be the same kind of calculation. So, okay, they had an ocean, they had a rainforest, they had agricultural fields. Are you going to produce anything while you're in there? Yeah, poop. You're going to produce urine and feces. So you can't ship that out of the biosphere. It's fertilizer. That goes back into the soil, and that provides nutrients for the plants to grow that you're going to then eat. What happens to the urine? It gets purified via the water cycle and filtration, and you drink the water again. It's a cycle. Well, astronauts on the space station, guess what they're drinking?
Pee.
Pee. Purified pee. It's cleaner than what you would get out of a tap on Earth. It's been through multiple levels of filtration. They had to account for all of that here because guess what? On this planet, in our biosphere, all of that is happening. It's just happening at a scale where you can't see it. You enclose it in a big dome and suddenly you can see it real clearly. So they were supposed to be in there for a year. 2 months in, oxygen levels began to drop to a point where people were exhibiting symptoms of low oxygen. What happens if you're not getting enough oxygen?
Lightheaded.
Oh, you're lightheaded, you get stupid, you get headaches, you can't perform very well. No, seriously, it impairs cognitive functioning.
Really?
You can't think clearly when you're not getting enough oxygen. Because your body will prioritize the brain for oxygen. If there's a choice between, cells in your finger and cells in your brain, your body will shunt oxygen to your brain. Your fingers will fall off long before your brain stops working. Your body will make sure your brain gets enough oxygen first. 2 months in, however, they were seeing signs that there was not enough. They were monitoring all the levels of everything. But they were seeing oxygen levels dropping, and they couldn't figure out why.
So if they would have walked outside, they would have...
Well, nobody died.
Oh,
This was, they were on Earth. They weren't that committed to it. Nobody died, but 2 months in, they actually had to import oxygen. They had to shoot oxygen into the system. They had miscalculated something. 2 things, actually. So what uses oxygen?
Oh.
Other.
Okay, so uses O2, animals. Produces O2, plants. So did they miscalculate the number of plants to animals? No, they didn't. They did not. There were 2 things that were using oxygen that they had miscalculated, in fact. Fish are an animal. Fish are an animal. Insects are an animal. But bacteria are not an animal. They're bacteria. And soil bacteria, many of them, decompose things using oxygen. So one part of it was the bacteria. There's something else. Are bacteria living or non-living? Living things. They can reproduce themselves. Okay. There was one other thing that was using up O2 that nobody thought of. I'm going to invite you to check this out. So the base of this giant thing was all built of cement. you just figured it out. They had a fairly thick, sort of like a cement slab underlying this whole greenhouse. And they had just built this thing. Remember I said on the moon or on Mars, this would take you decades to build. You might lay the foundation. You might bring up cement one load at a time. Has anybody here ever done any cement work, helped with a sidewalk or a driveway or a garage floor or anything? So what do you have to do special with cement if it's real hot? You've got to hose it down and keep it covered so it doesn't dry out too fast. As it dries out, what's interesting is it's not just drying out, it's actually undergoing a chemical change because it's absorbing something from the air around it. It's absorbing oxygen. Curing cement. That cement was not fully cured. Very thick cement can take years to fully cure. That cement... I don't know, I'm not a cement mason. You can ask somebody who knows more about cement than I do. But I do know that it takes a long time for cement to fully cure. There were two things that were using oxygen that they didn't correctly account for. This is an account book. This is money in, money out, except it's oxygen in, oxygen out, calories in, calories out. So you might balance a checkbook, your mom or dad might balance a checkbook. Here you're balancing the books on the materials of life. So there were soil bacteria that were using more oxygen than they had accounted for. And the cement itself, this non-living, is cement living? No. The cement itself was sucking up oxygen. So now this was opened, I think they did this in like 92. By the time I lived there, because I lived there in 93 to 94. And by the time I lived there, the big experiment was over. You could go tour it. You know, pay $15 and you could go through biosphere. Well, no. The Bionauts came out. They did stay the year, though they had to import oxygen, and it taught them some things about, you know, if we build a moon base, you better make sure that the cement is cured before you put people in there, because on the moon, there is no quick rescue of pumping in more oxygen. People just die. Well, because there's a limit to how much you can contain. What else happens if you have too much oxygen in the environment and not enough carbon dioxide? Your plants all die. Oxygen feeds fires really well. I just read a fantastic piece of science fiction set on a planet with a very, very oxygen-rich atmosphere. And one of the sort of plot features is how easily things burn on this planet, how quickly fires spread. Because the atmosphere, our atmosphere is 20% oxygen. The atmosphere on this planet is like 38% oxygen. And so one of the plot features is the fact that things burn really, really well. And fires are rather hard to contain. You know, Biosphere 1, was it a success or a failure?
Success.
They learned stuff.
Wait, one or
They
two?
learned a lot. I'm sorry, Biosphere 2. Biosphere 1, the experiment's still running. What's Biosphere 1?
Us.
You're sitting on it. Yeah, you're part of it. Biosphere 1 is the Earth. It's all of us. It's all the plants and the bacteria and the fish and the ducks and the worms and the fungus, the fireflies and the redwoods. It's all that stuff. Books are still out on that. We're still running the experiment. Who knows? Give us another, well, we have, 8 million years till the sun eats us, till the sun expands beyond us and we get cooked. So I guess we have 8 million years to figure out if it works or not. Biosphere 2, however, they closed the books on. It's now a research facility. They do still do research here. They have portions of it sealed off. You know, will we ever build bases on Mars or on the moon? Possibly. But that's a biosphere. That is where we will pick up tomorrow.